London, 1890. The city lay smothered in fog, while in Surrey death moved silently through the halls of Ashwood Estate. 2 corpses, each marked by a blackened stain upon the wrist. A whisper among the villagers, the Ashwood curse has returned. But superstition has never frightened Sherlock Holmes. What began with a letter to Baker Street drew us into a house of shadows, where portraits watched from the walls, the air itself seemed poisoned, and fear became as real as flesh. I was there. I saw it. And now I set it down for you. The curse of the Ashwood Estate. And if this tale captures you, consider subscribing, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Chapter 1. A letter from the mists. It was upon a morning in late November, when London lay shrouded beneath a pall of yellow fog, so dense that the very gaslight seemed to struggle against it, that I found myself seated opposite my friend Sherlock Holmes at our customary breakfast in Baker Street. The cheerless vapour pressed against our windows with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor, while from the street below came only the muffled clip-clop of a solitary hansom making its cautious way through the murk. The fire in our grate hissed and spat, as if in protest against the penetrating damp, and I had drawn my chair closer to its warmth while perusing the morning papers. Holmes, however, appeared entirely oblivious to the gloom without. He sat with his thin frame folded into his familiar pose, knees drawn up, pipe between his lips, studying the agony column of the Daily Telegraph with the absorbed attention of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. "You observe, Watson," said he, without lifting his grey eyes from the page, his long forefinger tracing the melancholy advertisements with scientific precision, "that human folly remains the most remarkably consistent of all the elements. Its particular manifestation this morning appears to be codicillary in nature." "Codicillary?" I inquired, looking up from an account of the previous evening's concert at the Albert Hall. "Wills and testaments, my dear fellow. No fewer than 3 separate anxieties within as many column inches, each concerning vanished legatees and disputed inheritances." He smiled with that peculiar mixture of amusement and contempt which he reserved for the more predictable forms of human weakness. "If I should ever establish an academy for the instruction of future consulting detectives, I would certainly set my pupils to the exhaustive study of lawyers' clerks and the epistolary habits of disappointed nephews. The patterns of avarice are as reliable as the movements of the celestial bodies." It was at precisely that moment, as if summoned by his words about inheritance, that Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing upon her silver salver an envelope of thick, cream-laid paper. The quality of the stationery was immediately apparent, as was the heraldic device embossed upon its seal, an ash tree, proper entwined with a stag's head erased, executed in the finest tradition of country heraldry. Holmes slit the envelope with the languid precision of a gourmet, selecting the choicest morsel from his plate. Yet as his eyes moved across the written lines, the languor fell from him as completely as if a veil had been drawn away. His nostrils, those mobile sentinels of his acute senses, dilated almost imperceptibly, while his grey eyes kindled with the light I had learned to associate with cases of unusual promise. "Watson," said he, setting down the letter with deliberate care, "we are cordially invited to investigate a curse." The communication, bearing the frank of Edgar, Lord Ashwood of Surrey, spoke in terms both urgent and mysterious of sudden deaths that had befallen his household. 2 members of his family circle had perished within the space of a month, each discovered in circumstances that defied rational explanation, and each bearing upon the wrist a strange black stain which the superstitious villagers had come to whisper of as the Ashwood leaf, a mark, they claimed, that appeared only upon those whom the ancient curse had selected for destruction. His lordship's letter concluded with an earnest plea for Holmes's immediate assistance, expressing the fear that a third misfortune was imminent, and that only my friend's renowned powers might prevent further tragedy from befalling the ancient house. "Most intriguing," Holmes murmured, his fingers drumming upon the breakfast table with that nervous energy which always seized him at the prospect of a new investigation. "A curse that leaves physical evidence of its visitation. How refreshingly methodical of the supernatural realm. What think you, Watson? Are you prepared for a brief sojourn in the Surrey countryside?" Within 3 hours, we had departed the fog-bound metropolis aboard the afternoon express from Victoria Station. The train carried us through a landscape transformed by the November weather into something from a fairy tale. Wet hedgerows gleaming like silver wire, fields shrouded in mist, and bare trees etched against a sky the colour of pewter. By late afternoon, we had reached the market town of Farnham, where a dog-cart awaited to convey us the remaining miles to our destination. The driver, a taciturn fellow whose weathered face spoke of decades spent in outdoor labour, proved surprisingly voluble once he learned our business. "Terrible goings-on up at the great house, gentlemen," he confided, as our vehicle rolled between dripping hedgerows. "Folk in the village won't go near the estate after dark. Say the curse has awakened after lying quiet these 50 years and more." As we approached the estate itself, winding between ancient beeches whose bare branches formed a Gothic cathedral overhead, Ashwood Hall rose from the mist like some creature of legend. The Tudor mansion crouched against a backdrop of dense forest, its many-windowed facade and twisted chimneys speaking of centuries of history layered upon its foundations like geological strata. Tendrils of fog writhed about its walls, and I confess that even in broad daylight the place possessed an atmosphere of brooding melancholy that would have been worthy of Mrs. Ratcliffe's most Gothic imaginings. Lord Edgar Ashwood met us at the front steps, and I was struck immediately by the change that anxiety had wrought in his features. Though he could not have been more than 40 years of age, his hair had begun to silver at the temples, and deep lines of care were etched about his eyes. He greeted us with the desperate relief of a man who has been drowning and suddenly spies a rope. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot express how grateful I am that you have come," he said, leading us into the dim interior of the hall. "I fear I am at my wits' end. The deaths of my cousin Arthur and my steward Pike have cast such a shadow over this house that I begin to doubt my own sanity." He conducted us to his library, a chamber lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes whose gilded spines caught the firelight like sleeping eyes. The very air seemed heavy with the accumulated secrets of generations, and I noticed that despite the warmth of the room, his lordship drew his coat closer about him, as if warding off some interior chill. There, in that atmosphere of quiet desperation, he recounted the circumstances of the 2 mysterious deaths. His cousin Arthur, a man of barely 30 years and robust health, had been found dead in his locked bedchamber 3 weeks past, with no sign of violence save for a peculiar black mark upon his wrist. The estate steward, Pike, had met a similar fate just 10 days ago under identical circumstances, door bolted from within, windows secured, and that same inexplicable stain marking the flesh like some diabolic signature. Holmes listened without interruption, his keen eyes moving constantly about the room, cataloguing details with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all his investigations. When the narrative concluded, he rose and moved to the great stone hearth, examining the carved mantelpiece with minute attention. "Tell me, Lord Ashwood," he said at last, turning back to our host with that quiet intensity which marked the beginning of so many of his inquiries. "In which chambers did these unfortunate gentlemen meet their ends?" And with those words, spoken in the gathering dusk of that November evening, Holmes turned his face toward the shadowed corridors of Ashwood Hall. Thus began our investigation into what the countryside knew as an ancient curse, but which my friend already suspected it might prove to be something far more intricate and infinitely more sinister than the workings of supernatural malice. As we prepared to follow Lord Ashwood deeper into the mysteries of his troubled house, I could not shake the feeling that the very walls around us held their breath, waiting to see whether Holmes's methods would prove sufficient to penetrate secrets that had been guarded for generations by mist and fear, and the convenient credulity of those who preferred supernatural explanations to the more disturbing truths that often lurked beneath them. Chapter 2. Chambers of the dead evening had descended upon Surrey with that premature haste which visits the English countryside in late autumn, and the white mist that had gathered in the park during our journey now pressed against every window-pane like curious fingers seeking entry. The ancient timbers of Ashwood Hall creaked and settled around us as Lord Ashwood led us through passages panelled in dark oak, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of passing hands and polished to a dull gleam by the attentions of generations of servants. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before us, lit at intervals by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows and filled the air with the scent of burning whale oil. Portraits of long-dead Ashwoods gazed down from their frames with the stern disapproval that seemed to be the hereditary expression of the family, while beneath our feet the floorboards groaned with what I fancied was the weight of accumulated secrets. "This was Pike's room," Lord Ashwood announced as we paused before a heavy oak door in the south wing of the house. He raised his candle higher, its flame wavering in some unfelt draught. "I found him here myself, seated in that chair by the fireplace. The door was bolted from within, the window latched securely, and his evening book had fallen from his lap to lie open upon the carpet." Holmes stepped into the chamber with the measured precision of a general surveying a battlefield. The room was simply but comfortably furnished. A narrow bed with carved headboard, a well-worn armchair drawn close to the hearth, a small writing desk beneath the casement window, and shelves lined with the practical volumes one might expect to find in a working man's quarters. Yet beneath the surface orderliness, I detected something unsettling, a quality of atmosphere that seemed to cling to the very air. My friend moved immediately to the fireplace, kneeling upon the hearthrug with that complete absorption in physical evidence which always marked his examinations. He sniffed delicately at the cold ashes, stirred them with a poker, and then drew forth what appeared to be a fragment of metal no larger than a shilling, and thin as paper. "Most instructive," he murmured, slipping the object into his waistcoat pocket without offering explanation. He then rose and began a systematic examination of the room, measuring distances with his eye, testing the strength of the bell pull, peering up the chimney flue with the aid of Lord Ashwood's candle, and standing in that profound, listening silence which made every nerve in my body quiver with anticipation. The odour that had troubled me became more distinct as my senses adjusted to the chamber, a faint but unmistakable scent of gas, as if the coal fires of London had somehow followed us into this rural retreat. Holmes noted it with a brief nod of satisfaction, though he made no comment aloud. From Pike's quarters we proceeded to the chamber where Arthur Ashwood had met his mysterious end. This room, being that of a family member rather than a servant, was appointed with greater luxury. Silk hangings, a mahogany four-poster bed, and furniture of obvious quality. Yet the same oppressive atmosphere pervaded it. The same faint, sweet, metallic scent hung in the air, and upon the washstand I observed a gentleman's cuff bearing a dark stain that had been shaped with macabre artistry into the likeness of a five-pointed leaf. "The mark appears upon the skin shortly after death," Lord Ashwood explained, observing the direction of my gaze. "Dr. Elphinstone, our family physician, can make nothing of it. He insists it resembles no natural phenomenon he has encountered in 30 years of practice." Holmes examined the stained cuff with his magnifying lens, holding it close to the candlelight and studying it from various angles. "Has this garment been laundered since your cousin's death?" "Mrs. Gray, our housekeeper, attempted to clean it, but the stain proved remarkably persistent. It seemed almost to darken with each washing, as if the very act of cleaning served only to set it more permanently." "Fascinating," Holmes murmured. "And you say this marking appeared upon the actual flesh as well?" "Upon the inner wrist of his left arm, exactly as in Pike's case. Dr. Elphinstone photographed both marks before burial, should you wish to examine the images." The household was summoned to the drawing-room for Holmes's preliminary interviews, and as they filed in, I studied each face with the attention my friend had taught me to pay to first impressions. Lady Beatrice Ashwood, Edgar's wife, proved to be a woman of perhaps 35 years, possessed of that pale but determined beauty which speaks of good breeding tempered by strength of character. Though the recent tragedies had clearly taken their toll, evident in the slight tremor of her hands and the shadows beneath her eyes, she maintained her composure with admirable grace. Dr. Elphinstone, the family physician, was a stout gentleman of the old school, with whiskers that spoke of decades in country practice and the confident bearing of one accustomed to being deferred to in matters of life and death. Yet I detected a note of uncertainty in his manner when the conversation turned to the mysterious deaths, the uncertainty of a rational man confronted with phenomena that defied his professional understanding. Mrs. Gray, the housekeeper, was a woman of middle years, whose capable hands and direct gaze spoke of efficiency and honesty. She had served the Ashwood family for more than 20 years, she informed us, and had never before witnessed such strange occurrences. The butler, Venn, was similarly forthright, a man whose dignity of bearing would not have been out of place in the grandest houses of Mayfair. Of particular interest was young George, an under-gardener, whose nervous manner and frequent glances toward his master suggested he possessed knowledge he feared to share. When questioned about the ghostly lights that village gossip claimed to have seen moving among the trees surrounding the estate, he confirmed that such phenomena had indeed been observed, though he was careful to attribute them to natural causes, will-o'-the-wisps perhaps, or the lanterns of poachers. The bell wires in both death chambers, Holmes inquired of Venn. I understand they failed to function when needed. That is correct, sir. In each case, when we attempted to respond to what we assumed were summons for assistance, we discovered that the wires had somehow become disconnected. Most peculiar, sir, as they had been in perfect working order the previous day. Holmes questioned each member of the household with that deceptively casual manner which concealed the most penetrating analysis, and I could see him filing away each response, each gesture, each telling detail that might later prove significant. Yet when the interviews concluded, he appeared more thoughtful than satisfied. We shall remain here tonight, he announced to Lord Ashwood after the servants had been dismissed. But first, I must pay a brief visit to the village. A consultation with the local blacksmith, the chemist, perhaps the photographer. Such professionals often possess information that proves invaluable to investigations of this nature. I watched from the library window as his tall figure disappeared into the white embrace of the fog, swallowed by the mist as completely as if Ashwood Hall had exhaled him into the darkness. Left alone in that oppressive chamber, with the wind moaning in the chimney and the ancient timbers groaning around me like the bones of some vast, sleeping creature, I could not entirely shake the feeling that the house itself was aware of our presence, that centuries of Ashwood history had somehow soaked into the very walls, creating an atmosphere in which past and present seemed to blur together like figures glimpsed through fog. The candles guttered in their holders, casting writhing shadows across the portraits of dead Ashwoods, and somewhere in the depths of the house a door closed with the finality of a coffin lid. As I settled into my chair by the dying fire to await Holmes's return, I reflected upon the strange circumstances that had brought us to this ancient house where death seemed to strike with the precision of clockwork and leave behind only questions written in stains that would not wash clean. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Walls. Holmes returned near the stroke of midnight, his hair beaded with moisture from the fog, and his grey eyes bright with that cold excitement which I had learned to associate with significant discoveries. He moved through the dimly lit hall with the silent precision of a cat, pausing only to warm his hands at the dying embers of the library fire before sharing the fruits of his nocturnal inquiries. The village chemist, he began without preamble, recalls selling a considerable quantity of lunar caustic to a gentleman caller some 3 weeks past, a purchase remarkable both for its size and for the buyer's insistence upon the finest grade available. The local blacksmith has been even more illuminating. He confesses to having fashioned several thin plates of iron to most unusual specifications, pieces no larger than a book, yet wrought with considerable precision. He withdrew from his pocket a small vial of clear liquid and a photographic plate wrapped in brown paper. Our photographer, roused from his bed by the promise of a sovereign, has provided this image of the estate chapel taken some months ago. Observe, Watson, the bricked-up aperture in the east wall, once, according to local legend, part of a smuggler's tunnel that connected the chapel to the main house. I studied the photograph in the lamplight, noting the careful masonry work that had been employed to seal what appeared to have been a sizable opening. "You suspect this passage remains functional? I suspect, my dear fellow, that the history of Ashwood Hall contains chapters that have been deliberately obscured from casual reading." He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded grounds. But suspicion without evidence is merely prejudice in evening dress. Come, let us test whether the past is as thoroughly buried as our hosts would have us believe. Armed with a dark lantern and my service revolver, we began a systematic exploration of the south wing, paying particular attention to the older sections where Tudor construction might have incorporated features from still earlier buildings. Holmes moved with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all his investigations, testing panels, measuring wall thicknesses, and listening with his ear pressed to the ancient oak. Behind a bookcase in a small anteroom adjacent to Pike's quarters, his sensitive fingers detected what mine could not, a section of panelling that yielded to pressure. The mechanism that operated it was cunningly concealed, but under his expert manipulation it gave way to reveal a narrow passage that led into the very heart of the building's structure. The corridor beyond was barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, its walls constructed of the rough stone that spoke of medieval origins. The air within was close and stale, heavy with the accumulated mustiness of centuries, and our footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space. After perhaps 30 paces, the passage opened into a small chamber directly beneath Pike's room, and there we discovered the first concrete evidence of the methodical intelligence behind Ashwood's mysterious deaths. Built into the flue of the steward's fireplace was a mechanism of diabolic ingenuity, a thin iron plate that could be adjusted by means of a lever to completely seal the chimney. Holmes examined it with professional admiration, noting the precision of its construction and the care with which it had been installed. "Observe the soot patterns, Watson," he said, directing the beam of his lantern upward into the flue. "This device has been operated recently, and more than once. When closed, it would trap the products of combustion within the chamber above, creating an atmosphere that would prove swiftly fatal to anyone within." "Carbonic oxide poisoning," I murmured, understanding flooding through me. "The gas would be invisible, nearly odorless. The victim would simply lose consciousness and never awaken." "Precisely so. And note the elegant simplicity of the method. No violence, no obvious signs of foul play, merely an unfortunate accident with a faulty flue. Add to this a touch of lunar caustic applied to the victim's wrist while unconscious, and you have created what appears to be supernatural intervention while employing purely natural means." We carefully restored the mechanism to its original position and prepared to retrace our steps when Holmes suddenly raised his hand for silence. From somewhere in the darkness ahead came the soft sound of footsteps, moving with careful deliberation along what must have been another branch of the passage system. We extinguished our light and waited, listening to the measured tread grow closer. Presently, a figure appeared, carrying a small bull's-eye lantern and moving with the confidence of one familiar with these hidden ways. In the dim glow, I recognized Lionel Vale, Lord Edgar's cousin and heir presumptive, a man I had noted earlier for his expensive London tailoring and somewhat too ready smile. He paused directly beneath us, apparently listening for any sound that might indicate discovery, and in that moment I observed that his right hand bore fresh scratches, and that his boots, expensive creations from some Bond Street establishment, carried upon their soles the distinctive red clay that I had noticed in the passages. When he had passed on into the darkness, Holmes touched my arm, and we began our careful retreat toward the main house. We emerged through the concealed panel to find the library apparently undisturbed, though Holmes immediately detected signs that someone had been examining the papers upon Lord Ashwood's desk during our absence. "Mr. Vale appears to be a gentleman of varied interests," Holmes observed quietly as we prepared to retire. "His nocturnal perambulations suggest either legitimate concern for his family's welfare or something considerably less noble." We retired to our respective chambers, though I found sleep elusive despite the day's exertions. The thought of those hidden passages, snaking through the ancient walls, carrying death on silent feet to unsuspecting victims, haunted my rest. Somewhere in the depths of the house, a clock struck the hours, and with each chime I was reminded that we were guests in a place where the very architecture had been turned to murderous purpose. The wind had risen with the departure of the fog, and it moaned through the eaves and rattled the casements with voices that seemed to echo from centuries past. In the distance, I could hear what might have been the cry of some night bird, or perhaps merely the complaint of ancient timbers settling under the weight of their accumulated secrets. As dawn approached, I dozed fitfully in my chair by the window, wrapped in the conviction that Ashwood Hall guard its mysteries jealously, and that the solution to its riddle lay hidden somewhere in the labyrinthine passages that honeycomb its foundations like the burrows of some vast, malevolent creature that fed upon the lives of those who sheltered within its walls. Chapter 4. The Science of Superstition. Dawn broke grey and cheerless over the Surrey countryside, but it brought with it a clarity of purpose that had been absent during the fog-shrouded uncertainties of the previous evening. Holmes was already dressed and alert when I descended to breakfast, his sharp features animated by that peculiar energy which always possessed him when a case approached its resolution. "Today, Watson," he announced over the morning papers, "we shall conduct certain experiments that should illuminate the darker corners of this affair. Science, properly applied, has a remarkable facility for dispelling the shadows in which superstition breeds." After breaking our fast, Holmes requested that Lord Ashwood provide him with a common fern leaf from the conservatory, along with access to the estate's photographic dark-room, a facility which his lordship had established for the pursuit of what he described as artistic interests. Thus equipped, Holmes set about demonstrating the methodology behind Ashwood's supernatural manifestations. Using the fern leaf as a stencil and a pencil of lunar caustic obtained during his village expedition, he carefully applied the chemical to the skin of my wrist. The process was painless, leaving only a faint mark that appeared insignificant in the dim light of the darkroom. "Now observe, my dear fellow," Holmes said, leading me to a south-facing window where the morning sun streamed through the glass. Within minutes of exposure to the light, the chemical stain began to darken dramatically, spreading and intensifying until it formed a perfect reproduction of the fern leaf in vivid black upon my skin. "Silver nitrate," Holmes explained with satisfaction, "quite harmless in small quantities, but possessed of the remarkable property of darkening when exposed to sunlight. A photographer's tool turned to the service of deception. the creation of apparently supernatural markings that would appear hours after the perpetrator had departed the scene. Lord Ashwood, who had observed this demonstration with growing amazement, sank into a nearby chair as the implications became clear. Then the curse, the Ashwood leaf. It is all artifice? Ingenious artifice, Holmes corrected, but artifice nonetheless. The leaf shape could be varied according to need, a simple matter of selecting appropriate stencils. The timing of its appearance could be calculated with precision, lending credence to the supernatural explanation while providing the actual murderer with perfect alibis. Our next experiment required a return to Pike's chamber, where Holmes set about recreating the conditions that had proved fatal to the unfortunate steward. Using one of the iron plates he had discovered in the hidden passage, he demonstrated how the flue could be sealed from below, forcing the products of combustion back into the room above. With the chimney thus blocked and the windows secured, Holmes lit a small charcoal brazier and closed the door. Within minutes, the air grew thick and oppressive, and I began to experience the telltale symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning, a heaviness in the chest, a growing lethargy, and a dangerous inclination toward sleep. "Enough," Holmes declared, throwing open both window and door to admit the clean morning air. "You see how easily death might creep upon a man who trusted in the security of his own chambers. The victim would lose consciousness gradually, peacefully, with no awareness of his danger, until it was far too late for resistance or escape." While the room aired, we continued our investigation of the estate's hidden geography. The sealed passage connecting the chapel to the main house proved to be as functional as Holmes had suspected, its exit concealed among a grove of ash trees that gave the estate its name. Beneath the chapel's iron grating, Holmes's keen eyes detected the unmistakable imprint of expensive boots, specifically the half-moon heel plate that marked the work of Lobb of St. James's Street. Mr. Vale's nocturnal expeditions appear to follow a regular pattern, Holmes observed, photographing the footprints with the camera he had borrowed from Lord Ashwood. A man of fashion, even when engaged in clandestine activities. Armed with this accumulating evidence, Holmes dispatched telegrams to both the local constabulary and to Inspector Lestrade in London, requesting that certain inquiries be made regarding Lionel Vale's recent financial circumstances. The replies, when they arrived that afternoon, painted a picture of mounting debts, pressing creditors, and the sort of desperate monetary situation that might drive a gentleman to contemplate the most extreme remedies. "The motive becomes clear," Holmes explained as we reviewed the telegrams in the library. "Mr. Vale stands to inherit substantially upon Lord Ashwood's death, but his immediate needs are pressing. The systematic elimination of other potential heirs would both accelerate his inheritance and ensure its magnitude." The remainder of the day passed with an oppressive stillness that seemed to settle over Ashwood Hall like a physical presence. Servants moved quietly through their duties, speaking in hushed voices when they spoke at all. The November light hung low and reluctant in the sky, and even the usual sounds of the countryside seemed muffled and distant. Holmes spent the afternoon in careful preparation, checking the arrangements he had made with the local authorities and ensuring that every detail of his plan was perfectly understood. As dusk approached, he requested that the entire household assemble in the great dining hall that evening, explaining that he had reached certain conclusions regarding the recent tragedies that would be of interest to all concerned. "Tonight," he told me, as we watched the shadows lengthen across the estate's grounds. "We shall draw the various threads of this investigation together and see what pattern emerges. I confess, Watson, that while the methodology of these crimes has been ingenious, the motive remains depressingly commonplace, the old familiar trinity of greed, impatience, and the belief that murder is merely another form of investment." As the last light faded from the western sky and candles were lit throughout the house, I could not shake the feeling that Ashwood Hall itself was holding its breath, waiting to learn whether its ancient stones would continue to harbour deadly secrets, or whether Holmes's relentless logic would finally drag them into the purifying light of exposure and justice. The dining hall awaited us, its long table gleaming in the candlelight, its walls lined with the portraits of generations of Ashwoods who had lived and died within these walls. Soon those silent witnesses would observe the resolution of a mystery that had transformed their ancestral home into a charnel house disguised as a gentleman's residence. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The great dining hall of Ashwood presented a scene worthy of Rembrandt's brush as the household assembled that evening. Candles in silver sconces cast a warm golden glow over the polished oak table, while the portraits of long-dead Ashwoods gazed down from their frames with expressions that seemed peculiarly attentive, as if they too awaited the resolution of mysteries that had cast such a shadow over their ancestral home. Holmes stood at the head of the table, his tall figure commanding attention through stillness rather than gesture, while in his hands he held the thin iron plate whose discovery had unlocked the secret of Ashwood's supernatural curse. The assembled company, Lord and Lady Ashwood, Dr. Elphinstone, Lionel Vale, and the principal servants, watched him with that mixture of fascination and apprehension which attends moments when long-hidden truths prepare to emerge into the light. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed chamber, "I have gathered you here this evening to discuss certain facts that have come to light regarding the recent tragic deaths in this household. What you have attributed to supernatural malevolence, I regret to inform you, is nothing more than human malice employing the tools of modern science to create an illusion of otherworldly intervention." He held up the iron plate, its surface catching the candlelight. "This device, when installed in a chimney flue, can completely seal the passage and force the products of combustion back into the room above. The result is an atmosphere heavy with carbonic oxide, a gas that kills silently, leaving no wounds upon the body and no obvious signs of violence. To those unversed in the properties of such gases, the death would appear natural, mysterious, inexplicable." Lady Ashwood's hand moved instinctively to her throat. "You mean to say that Arthur and Pike were murdered?" "Murdered most methodically, madam, and with considerable preparation. The killer required access to the hidden passages that honeycomb this ancient house, passages that would allow him to install and operate his deadly mechanism without detection. He also required knowledge of chemistry sufficient to create the false marks that you have interpreted as supernatural stigmata." Holmes withdrew from his waistcoat pocket the small vial of lunar caustic and a pressed fern leaf. With swift efficiency, he demonstrated the process by which the seemingly mystical Ashwood leaf could be created. The application of silver nitrate through a vegetable stencil, the delayed reaction when exposed to sunlight, the permanent stain, that would resist all attempts at removal. The timing was carefully calculated, he continued. The chemical would be applied while the victim lay unconscious from gas poisoning, ensuring that the mark would not appear until hours after the murderer had departed the scene. To superstitious minds, such delayed manifestation would seem proof of supernatural agency. Throughout this exposition, I had been watching Lionel Vale carefully, noting how his habitual composure had gradually given way to signs of increasing agitation. His hands, normally steady, had developed a slight tremor, and his eyes moved constantly about the room as if seeking some avenue of escape from Holmes's inexorable logic. The question that remained, Holmes continued, was the identity of our calculating murderer. Who possessed the necessary knowledge of the house's hidden architecture? Who had access to the victims' chambers? Who stood to benefit from their deaths? The answer, I fear, points to one person only. As if responding to some unspoken cue, Inspector Lestrade appeared in the doorway, flanked by two constables whose presence seemed to fill the room with an air of official gravity. In his hand he carried a telegram, and his weathered features bore the expression of a man who had seen too much of human wickedness to be surprised by fresh evidence of it. "Mr. Lionel Vale," Lestrade announced, his voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. "I have here a warrant for your arrest on charges of murder. My inquiries in London have revealed debts totaling more than £5,000, along with evidence that you recently commissioned both the chemical supplies and the mechanical devices employed in these crimes." Vale's composure finally cracked completely. With a snarl of desperation, he lunged toward the fireplace, where a collection of antique weapons decorated the mantelpiece. His intention was clearly to seize one of the ornamental swords, but Holmes was ready for such a move. With the fluid grace of a trained athlete, my friend intercepted Vale's desperate rush, bringing him down in a tangle of limbs and overturned furniture. The struggle was brief, but violent. Vale fought with the strength of desperation, but he was no match for Holmes's wiry strength and scientific understanding of leverage. Within moments, the constables had him secured in handcuffs, though his eyes still blazed with the fury of a cornered animal. "You understand nothing," he spat, his voice thick with rage and frustration. "This mouldering pile of stones, these endless debts, the constant condescension. I would have made something of the estate, given it life again. Instead, it will pass to Edgar's unborn heirs, while I rot in debtor's prison." "Instead," Holmes replied calmly, adjusting his cuffs where Vale's fingernails had left their mark, "you will face the consequences of having chosen murder as a solution to financial embarrassment. A poor bargain by any measure." As the prisoner was led away into the November night, Lord Ashwood sank heavily into his chair, the weight of revelation evident in every line of his features. "My own cousin," he murmured, "to think that I welcomed him into my home, trusted him with my family's safety." Lady Ashwood, pale but composed, spoke the words that seemed to echo the thoughts of all present. "Mr. Holmes, I am very grateful that reason still lives in England, and that there are those with the wit to distinguish between genuine mystery and manufactured terror." The following morning dawned clear and bright, the fog of previous days having finally lifted to reveal the Surrey countryside in all its autumn splendor. Holmes and I took our leave of Ashwood Hall as the sun climbed above the horizon, painting the ancient stones with gold and transforming the place from a house of shadows into what it had always been, a noble residence whose only curse was the human failing that turned family bonds into murderous calculations. As our train carried us back toward London, through landscapes now bright with morning light, Holmes leaned back in his seat and drew deeply of the clean country air that flowed through our open window. "There is nothing quite so pernicious as superstition, Watson," he observed, watching the Sussex Downs roll past our window, "unless it be the appetite that deliberately feeds upon it. When next the world offers you a curse, hold it up to the light of scientific inquiry. If it darkens and takes new shapes, suspect chemistry rather than the supernatural. If it vanishes entirely, it was likely nothing more substantial than fear given form by ignorance." I nodded, though my thoughts remained troubled by what we had witnessed. "The villagers will continue to speak of the Ashwood curse, I suspect. Truth has a way of losing ground to legend when the legend is more satisfying to believe." "Undoubtedly," Holmes agreed. "Yet that is not our concern. We are not missionaries of rationality, merely practitioners of it when circumstances require our services. Let the village folk keep their ghost stories if they find comfort in them, provided those stories are not being used as camouflage for more earthly villainy." He fell into one of his contemplative silences as the train carried us through the brightening countryside, and I found myself reflecting on the strange case that had brought us to Surrey, the methodical nature of Vale's crimes, the calculated use of superstition as a screen for murder, the corruption of scientific knowledge in service of the basest motives. All of it spoke to a form of evil more chilling than any supernatural malevolence. When we reached Victoria Station and the familiar chaos of London's morning traffic, Holmes seemed to shake off the melancholy that had settled upon him during our journey. "Come, Watson," he said, stepping briskly onto the platform. "Baker Street awaits, and with it, no doubt, fresh mysteries that will require our attention. The world, I find, never lacks for puzzles that demand solving, though I confess I sometimes wish they were of a more elevating character." As our hansom carried us through streets once again shrouded in the familiar yellow fog of the metropolis, I could not help but contrast London's honest industrial murk with the deceptive mists of Surrey that had concealed such carefully planned malice. Here, at least, the air might be thick with coal smoke and the thousand odours of urban life, but it carried no hidden threat of death creeping through ancient passages to claim the unsuspecting. So concluded our investigation into what the countryside knew as the Ashwood curse, a case that served as a sobering reminder that the most dangerous supernatural phenomena are often those manufactured by entirely human hands. To the end of my days, whenever fog lies heavy over London, and the air carries that faint metallic taste that speaks of hidden fires, I recall that Tudor mansion crouching in its grove of ash trees, and I am grateful that reason, in the person of Sherlock Holmes, proved sufficient to dispel shadows that might otherwise have claimed still more innocent lives. The ancient house stands yet, I believe, restored to its proper dignity as the seat of a noble family rather than a charnel house disguised as a gentleman's residence. But sometimes, in the depth of November nights, when the wind moans through London's chimneys and rattles the windows of Baker Street, I fancy I can still hear the echo of those hidden passages breathing their deadly secrets into rooms where trust should have provided sanctuary, and I offer a silent prayer that such ingenuity may never again be turned to such diabolic purpose. And so, the mystery of the Ashwood Estate was laid bare, not by superstition, nor by whispers of curses, but by the cold, clear light of Sherlock Holmes's reason. To the world, it was just another tale of fear. To me, it was a reminder that behind every shadow there lies a truth waiting to be uncovered. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to subscribe for more untold cases from the world of Sherlock Holmes, and share in the comments where you're listening from. I'd be honored to know. Until the next case, keep your lamp burning, and beware the fog.